So it'd be really good if we can get some interaction going as well. So for those that don't know me, my name is Tabby Kerwin. Some of you may be very familiar with my husband, Simon. He had quite a few many years working with Scottish bands. I am a, what should we say, a relapsed cornet player. I don't play much, so that was how I started in brass bands, as a cornet player and a conductor, a band manager. I did the full works of the different roles you can do within a band. I work now as a writer, and I have an events company. Well, I have 3 businesses as Mode 4, but I do a lot of writing, and the bulk of my work at the minute is training around performance coaching, resilience coaching, and mental health training as well. I'm a instructor for Mental Health First Aid England, and it was very much my desire to bring the conversation about mental health very much to the fore in brass bands, because having been so involved with bands and from personal experience, I was aware of how much I was affected. So I actually spent 10 years living with anxiety and depression for about, well, I'm recovered now. I've been recovered about 3 years, and I say now that I am very much recovered because I've learned how to manage it all. But a lot of, though I was quite a vulnerable person, shall we say, a vulnerable mind, it was my role within brass band that really triggered my mental ill health. So when I started talking about it all, other people would say to me, oh, that's the same for me. That's why I don't play in a band anymore. That's why I had to give up playing. And it was very much from the stress and anxiety that would spiral and people not be able to manage it. And I realized that there was a big conversation to be had around mental health in brass bands. So hence I became very vocal and very adamant that this was a conversation that needs to be had. So the fact that, you know, you guys are picking up on it, involved in it, I'm really grateful to you for that, and very humbled by the fact that people are picking up on this conversation. Now I'm just going to try and do a bit of a share screen with you. Let's see how this goes. Okay. Whether this works my end though, if I can move the slides. So that's me. Is it going to let me move them? Yes, it is. Okay, so just before I start, that's the intro to me. What I do like to do in these sessions is just kind of have a little bit of an agreement in place, just really so we're safe sharing, and confidentiality is very important when we're talking about mental health. So by confidentiality, I'm very happy for anyone to repeat anything that I say, but all I will ask is that we create this as a safe space. So if somebody within the session does talk about something that's personal to them, that we keep it very safe. We're very mindful of that confidentiality within this session, and also that we really respect the opinions of others, that we, you know, we listen without judgment, we're kind, and we talk about things, but we can also smile and have some fun with it as well. So if everyone's okay with all of that, does that sound okay to everybody? Yep. It's good. As I said as well, if people want to chip in with any conversations, that would be great. Okay, we want this to be a discussion rather than me just presenting to you. Okay, so what is mental health? Tell me, what do you think mental health is? Anyone want to contribute? Okay, you can be as un-PC as you like. It could be words that you've heard people described as with mental ill health. So yeah, we don't have to be very PC here, and there is no right or wrong. Okay, so when I say the words mental health, what springs to mind?
Rationally.
State of mind.
Situations come to you.
Okay, situations, yeah. State of mind. Anything else?
Happiness.
Happiness, yeah.
General well-being.
General well-being, okay, great, yep. Anything else?
Confidence.
Confidence, okay. Is it always negative? No? Positive as well. What about playing in brass bands? Is that good for our mental health?
Yes.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. Music is a very well-known source of well-being, of positive well-being. But like anything, we're working within a very stressful environment, so it can have negative impact as well. So let's just have a look at what mental health actually is. Okay, mental health is actually our overall health. Now, if you look at the World Health Organization, their definition of mental health is a state of well-being in which every individual realizes their own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. Okay, so that's what mental health is, defined by the World Health Organization, sorry. But essentially, that's very complicated to have to remember and also to deliver to someone if they're experiencing difficulties. So the best thing that we can say to someone is that we all have mental health, okay? It is our overall health. It's how we think, how we feel, and how we behave, okay? It's how we cope with general ups and downs of life, how we feel about ourselves and our future, how we deal with negative situations as well as positive ones. It's about our self-esteem and our confidence, how stress affects us. And mental health works on a continuum, and this is the really important thing to remember. It's very, very fluid. So one moment it can be absolutely brilliant, you could be feeling great, and then you might take a phone call with some bad news, and then you might not feel so great. So it's constantly moving. It's very, very fluid. That's really important to remember. But the key of what mental health is, it's our overall health, and it's something that we all have. Let's look at kind of the reality of mental health and mental ill health, okay? 1 in 4 people will experience some form of mental health issue in any given year. Okay, that's the stats that we all see. You might have seen it from the charity Mind or other sources as well. How do we feel about this statistic? Do we think that's an accurate reflection? 1 in 4 people?
I thought it'd be higher.
Okay, think it would be higher. Anyone else want to chip in?
It would be high.
It's not unsurprising. Yeah, I think that's.
Okay.
I think you put that number up, and most people would say, yeah, maybe that's about right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so this is the stats that we all get given, that you'll see from various charities. This was a stat that was created by Minds and Mental Health Task Force in 2016. There's no doubting that, especially over recent times with COVID, that there will be an increase. We will see an increase in the rate mental ill health for sure, but those stats obviously haven't come out. What we're looking at is that they think the rate of depression will have increased by 50% just during COVID. So that's what we're looking at. When I look at this stat, I think this is the reality of mental health as dictated by stats. The issue I have with this is I actually think it's nearer 1 in 2 people. And the reason is this 1 in 4 statistic is a number which is purely based on people that have either been diagnosed or referred to a mental health service, okay? So we know for a fact there are many, many millions of people who are undiagnosed. So for instance, myself, I had 10 years with anxiety and depression, but I was actually undiagnosed. And there are millions of people like me that fall into that category. So I think the reality is it's possibly nearer 1 in 2. Now, when we factor into this results, some research that I did last year into brass bands, which I don't know, some of you may have taken part in, I did a report and survey into the state of mental health within brass bands. And that was based on previous research that was done in 2016 by Help Musicians UK as part of its MAD, Music and Depression campaign. And they did this with Music Tank and the University of Westminster. And the statistics that they worked out was that musicians are 3 times more likely to be affected by mental ill health than the general public. Now, this was quite a succinct survey. They had over 2,000 people contribute to it, and they looked at orchestras and choirs and rock bands, but the one medium that they didn't look at, of course, was brass bands. So the survey that I did was the same questions. It was based on the same principles as that survey. And I had 328 respondents in the 3 weeks that I ran this survey. And the statistics came out exactly the same, that the musicians are 3 times more likely to experience mental ill health than a general public. So if we work on a 1 in 4 stat, that's, we can equate this into our band room. If we multiply that by 3, because musicians are 3 times more likely. That's a lot of people in our band rooms that are, you know, we could be looking at kind of 20 people in our band room that are being affected by mental ill health at any one time. And that's why it's so important to have these discussions. Other things that we can put under the reality of mental health, if you like, are Okay, so mental issues, health issues are common. We know that. And also that depression is one of the leading causes of disability worldwide. Okay, so the stats on that are very high for depression. It is one of the leading causes of disability. Often when we think about disability, we think of the physical side. Our first image might be someone in a wheelchair, but this is what we call, you know, hidden disabilities. Okay, and depression is one of the highest rating disabilities. So we're going to do a little bit of a quiz. Okay, so first question. Mental ill health is responsible for 17 million lost working days and 10 billion each year in the UK. Do we think this is true or false?
Yeah.
True.
True?
True.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a resounding, I think, decision that it's true. Well, I can tell you, it's false. It's actually 91 million lost working days and 30 billion pounds each year. It's more than any other illness. Okay, that's what the cost is. But having these conversations, doing this, it's not about the cost. For me, it's always about having these conversations. If we can help just one person to open up that conversation, and that, you know, we can really save lives with this. So it's not about the money. But yeah, 91 million lost working days. And, you know, again, it could even be more, because a lot of people aren't ringing up and saying, I'm not feeling very well mentally. They're ringing up and saying, I've got a bad back, I've got D&V, things like that. So again, the stats aren't always accurate. Surprised by that one then, that it's that many?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, not really. When you gave us the numbers, like you're saying 1 in 4 going to like 1 in 2 people, then you consider the size of the population, 17 million lost working days is not that high. And then,
No, exactly. Yeah, it just seems a high number when you first see it.
It is, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, next question. Okay, the total cost of mental health issues to the economy in England for 2009-2010 was 105.2 billion per year. True or false?
False. True.
Okay. Okay, we've got some trues and some falses, bit of a mixed one there. Okay, I can tell you it is true. And that is similar to the entire budget of the National Health Service. And that's the cost of the economy. So yeah. Okay, next question. 25% of mental illness starts before the age of 18 years old. True or false?
False, I think it'll be higher.
False, you think it'll be higher? Okay, yeah, you're absolutely right. 75% of mental illness starts before the age of 18 years old, which is why it's so important to have open and honest conversation with our kids and our youth bands, you know, the children that we teach, our own children. It's really important to start to normalize this idea of mental ill health, so people will open up and talk about their experiences, and we can then signpost them to the help that they need. Okay, next question. In the UK, 35% of people with diagnosable mental illness receive no treatment. True or false?
True.
It's higher.
True.
Okay, we've got a lot of trues, and then we've got a few that think it will be higher. Okay, I can tell you it is higher. Okay, 75% of people with a diagnosable mental illness receive no treatment. Okay, that's how many people are walking around undiagnosed. So when we look at that stat of 1 in 4, that's people that have been diagnosed, but we know there's 75% of people that have a diagnosable mental illness that aren't being treated. Suicide is the most common cause of death for men aged 20 to 49 in England and Wales.
True.
I know that's not applicable to Scotland, but you know. True?
True.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely true. In new research that came out, that was UK-wide research that came out at the start of September, it confirmed this. There's around 18 suicides a day in the UK. A vast majority of those are people that have been undiagnosed. They haven't been referred to mental health services. And the highest in men, there's like a 1 to 3. So men take 75% of the suicide deaths over women. Why do we think the rate is higher in men than women?
Because men are inclined not to speak about it.
Very true. Men don't talk. Men won't go to doctors. They won't go for help. Okay. Women are more likely to talk about it and get referred for the help and support that they need, whereas men don't. The highest age-specific rate of suicide in men was actually 45 to 49 years old. But we also saw a huge increase in women. The age of which age specific category do you think in women did we see the highest rate of increase of suicide?
35 to 40.
Okay, 35 to 40. It was 10 to 24. 10 years old to 24 years old has seen the highest rate of increase in suicide in women. And that's because, well, anyone want to hazard a guess as to why that is?
Internet.
Yeah, pressure.
Pressure.
Yeah,
Image.
pressure. Social media. We've got, it's not just people getting bullied in a playground anymore. It's coming over multiple social media platforms. There's also been things go around like a couple of years ago. Well, last year there was the thing, the Momo thing that I don't know if people knew. There was this figure of Momo that would appear in Peppa Pig. So that was targeted at young children. There was also something called the Dolphin Challenge. Did anyone hear of that one? So this was something that was sent out to sort of pre-teens, early teenage years, to children via various social media platforms. And the Dolphin Challenge, it was a 30-day challenge that these children were encouraged to do. And it would start off with day 1, go to bed or wake up at 2 a.m. On day 14, it was carve a dolphin into your arm. And by day 30, it was kill yourself. And here where I am in Yorkshire, in the period that before they could lock it down, we lost 600 children to that because of this challenge that was going around social media. And people don't share it, but we're in such a privileged position in brass bands that we work with so many youngsters that, you know, we just having the conversations about things so they know that it's okay to talk to us about these things, to talk about the feelings they're having. You know, we just have so much power within brass bands to be able to help so many people. Any questions so far that anyone wants to just pick up on any of the points there or not? No? All good. We will do a Q&A at the end, but just if there's anything along the way that really strikes anyone, then do let me know. So we're going to talk about language and mental health. Okay, generally splits into 2 categories: acceptable, neutral and positive words, unacceptable, judgmental and negative. All the acceptable, neutral and positive words, what kind of things do we think those are? Anyone want to throw any positive or neutral words at me?
Good.
Yeah, good, yeah.
It's good so far.
Yeah, absolutely. Positive, yeah. All the words we do. What about, I don't say, it's not very easy to come up with positive or neutral words about mental health, is it? Is it easier to come up with negative ones?
Depressive.
Yeah, depressing. What kind of, how are people with mental ill health referred to? How does the media refer to them? Words like psycho, loony, weirdo, all these things. Yeah, absolutely. It's so much easier to come up with negative words about it. And that's not just because we're really bad people and we're used to doing it. There is science behind it, okay? So science and language things behind it as well, just how our language has evolved. In the English dictionary, how many words do you think there are that broadly relate to emotions? Anyone want to guess? Throw me a number.
I have no idea.
100.
Stunned silence. Okay, I'll tell you. There's 2,000 words in the English dictionary that refer to emotions, that broadly relate to emotions. Only 30% of them are positive. So there is a natural bias towards the negative. And this goes right back to cavemen, or sorry, I should say cave people for interest of equality. Cave people. And, you know, they had this negative bias that they built into themselves. Every time they stepped foot out of a cave, they had to work on the theory that I am going to get killed when I step out of this world. That saber-toothed tiger is going to get me. So this negative bias in our brains goes right back to then, and we've just carried it forward. And our language just doesn't support us naturally in being able to go towards the positive. But that's why it's really important that when we're talking about mental health, we're very mindful of the language that we use. So if we can move away from things like suffer or things like that, you know, someone that's got mental ill health, okay, we don't want them to feel that they're suffering, okay, they're living with or experiencing something. Likewise, suicide. With suicide, we often say people commit suicide. How do we feel about that word? Good or bad?
Bad.
Bad, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's not as black and white as good or bad. But it is something that we encourage people to move away from, because commit has a tendency, a connotation towards a crime, okay? And suicide isn't a crime. It was actually decriminalised in this country, in the UK in 1961, okay? Do you know what the, until 1959, do you know what the sentence was for suicide? Death. Yeah, go figure. Makes loads of sense, doesn't it? But yeah, but it was actually decriminalised in 1961 here in the UK. So that's why we want to move away from words such as that. So we, instead of commit, we could use, some people go for completed, but that doesn't really sit comfortably with others. But took their life, died by suicide, anything like that is way more acceptable. So we can be really mindful of the language we use, and we can be mindful of that in our band rooms as well. You know, how we speak to people, making sure that we're talking to people with respect and dignity, and, you know, giving people more confidence, and rather than just words that might undermine. Being mindful all the time that we don't necessarily know what someone's going through in their own life, because they might not feel in a place to be able to open up about it at that time. Okay, let's move on. So the other thing about language is that stigma and discrimination are widespread, partly due to language. Okay, so the language that we can use can help us knock down the stigma around mental health, because stigma is really a barrier from people that getting the help and that they need to recover. So influences on mental health then. The things, we put these into two categories, okay? Risk factors and protective factors. So risk factors are things that can affect our mental health in a poor way. It can encourage poor mental health. Protective factors are the things that protect our mental health, that encourage us to have good mental health. They're divided into two categories. So there's individual and societal. By individual, so individual risk factors. Anyone want to guess what any individual risk factors to mental health might be?
Genetics.
Genetics can play a part, yeah, for sure. Anything else?
Previous experiences.
Previous experiences, yeah. Any others? Bereavement, yeah, absolutely. And then we've got things like alcohol, drugs, smoking, abuse, stress, traumatic life events, lack of support, illness, disability. All these things can play a part. They're what we'll call individual risk factors. What about societal risk factors? What might they be?
Poverty.
19 would be one.
Yep. Poverty, yep. Unemployment, poor education, poor housing, community violence, disempowering services. We've got strands of inequality. So within that, we've got our cultural strains, or mental health and religion, mental health and culture, mental health and religion. All those things fall under our strands of inequality. And of course, stigma and discrimination. What influences positive mental health, though, are protective factors. What could individual protective factors be?
Family support.
Yep, family support, definitely. Positive parenting, self-belief, confidence, communication, that's really important. Communication, coping skills, making sure we've got healthy coping skills, and sort of respectful relationships, be that friendships or within family dynamics, or with loved ones. In terms of our kind of societal protective factors, people having meaningful activities, social networks, arts and culture, things to do, physical exercise, but pretty much everything that a brass band gives to someone falls within our protective factors, our societal protective factors. So that's why bands are so important for people and their well-being, but we just have to be mindful of this fine line of where stress plays a part. So stress is a normal thing, isn't it? We all experience stress, agreed?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Brass bands can be brilliant, but they can also be highly stressful. Yeah. If anyone's a band manager here, they'll know how stressful it is. If anyone's a conductor, they'll know how stressful it is. Anyone that sits on principal seats, anyone that's ever played in a contest, stress gets us all in brass bands, okay? It's really common. Stress as a whole, we can divide it into 5 categories of physical, environmental, emotional, acute life events, and chronic. So those are the 5 different types of stress. Okay, so physical, where we don't help ourselves, late nights, binge drinking, drug use, lack of routine. Environmental, poor housing, unemployment, new environments as well, such as moving house and holidays. So it's not always just bad things that cause stress. Positive things can cause stress as well, be it weddings, giving birth, things like that. You know, they cause stress as well. Emotional stress, relationships problems, peer pressure, conflicting cultural values, leaving home, marriage, acute life events, bereavement, illness, accidents, pregnancy, more extreme rape and assault, chronic stress as well, accommodation problems, debts, prolonged use of drugs and alcohol. Okay, so we're just going to have a little look at stress. The reason I put this in here, it's really important for us all to have an idea of our own stress levels, and also be mindful of other people's, knowing that what's stressful for one person might not be stressful. So something that's not stressful for me at all might be really stressful for someone else. Okay, so we all have different stress levels. This stress vulnerability model, okay, this was created by some psychologists, Joseph Zubin and Bonnie Spring, and it basically just shows us that those that have high levels of vulnerability are more likely to develop mental health issues when stress levels rise. So our vulnerability, we all have a different vulnerability. Our vulnerability is based on anything from genetic makeup to what we've been through, and our life experiences. It might be childhood trauma, it might be stressful life events, anything like that. So if you've been through an awful lot of things, then your vulnerability is likely to be, you're likely to be very vulnerable. So on here, this just shows us that those that have a high level of vulnerability, they don't need a lot of stress to make them unwell. I think it's fairly clear cut, this stress vulnerability model. Taking that a little bit further then, of managing our stress. So if you imagine that your vulnerability is a bucket, or you might have heard it referred to as a container or something, but we'll use a bucket in this analogy. So it's like a bucket that fills up with water, and the water is the stress, essentially. Okay, so if your bucket there is constantly getting stress into it, at some point it is going to overflow. When it overflows, it's going to cause us problems, okay, such as emotional snapping, mental ill health. So what we need is to develop some coping strategies. So we've got a little tap on our bucket. So when the bucket starts getting filled, we can open our tap, and our tap is essentially our helpful coping strategies. So that might be good diet, exercise. It might be things like reading, listening to music. It might be going to band for some people. So that's what we want to do. If people have got unhelpful coping strategies, such as drinking too much, working in excess, anything like that, then, you know, unhealthy lifestyle, then that's going to be an unhelpful coping strategy, and that's going to block the tap. So again, the bucket's going to overflow. Now, if you're vulnerable, if you've been through a lot, then you're going to have a very, very small bucket. But it's not the size that matters, it's how you learn to manage your stress within it. So for example, essentially my bucket is quite small really, because I was a 16-year-old child who lost her dad to cancer. I had 10 years with anxiety and depression. When I was younger, I did experience an eating disorder. In later life, obviously my husband's died. So essentially I've been through a lot. I've got a lot of experiences there, which would lead to a very small bucket, if you like, due to my vulnerability. But what I have learned to do is to fill that bucket up very, very, very slowly, because I use helpful coping mechanisms. But it's quite a good analogy for how we can manage our own stress. And when we're talking about mental health, it's really important that we put our own health first, that we manage our own stress, that we put all these things in place, because the more we look after ourselves, the easier it's going to be to help and support other people. Does that stress bucket kind of make sense to people? Does that, yeah?
Yeah.
It's quite a good analogy. It's quite helpful. And I think it's quite, something quite helpful that you can share with, friends who are going through something as well, be that in bands or family or things. It is helpful. Okay, stress management. Okay, so most people can cope with short bursts of stress, but prolonged stress is linked to mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression. So this is something that we can be mindful of in managing our stress. Okay, so that's really important. We need to be able to help ourselves. Do we know what the stress hormone is?
Cortisol.
Cortisol, yes. Yeah. Do we know how it's released or how it works? No. So this is something that people experience, especially if you're, about to go into a performance that's quite stressful. Cortisol is released into our bodies, but it actually takes 7 minutes for it to start functioning. So in those 7 minutes, if you can implement helpful things such as breathing exercises or things like that, that's going to reduce the level of cortisol, because once cortisol is in our body, it stays there for 48 hours, which means someone that's under continual stress, it could, just keep building up the level of stress and they can't necessarily manage it very well. Right, so so cortisol is released. So what we can do, this is why it's really important. If you imagine you're in a situation, a pre-performance situation in band, if you can get people to focus on managing their stress as part of your build up for a contest, say, we're not just learning the piece, we're not just learning what we're performing, we're learning how to perform it. And if we can build up good, be it breathing exercises or things like that that help manage our stress, then we're going to help people to be able to control the release of cortisol in their body. Now, we need this cortisol because cortisol is like our alarm system in our body. It's what triggers our fight, flight, freeze and flop. So have we heard of fight and flight? Yeah. So fight and flight, those two are quite explainable. So fight is when we're like, yes, I'm going to go for it. Flight is when we want to run away from something, but that's been extended recently. So we've got freeze and flop in there as well. So this is what cortisol can do as well. Freeze is in a mild situation. It might be you're sat in a band rehearsal and you don't agree with something the conductor said, but you're like, I can't say anything because here's the conductor, so you don't say anything. That's freeze. In an extreme version of freeze, that would be someone who has perhaps been abused or attacked or raped or something, and they don't physically have the power to be able to fight someone off. Okay, because they're frozen, and that's the effect that cortisol has on them. And flop is when someone can literally just faint because of the release of cortisol into their body. So fight, flight, freeze and flop are our 4 stages of what cortisol does to us. But yeah, if we can help encourage people to have helpful coping strategies that can help them control that release of cortisol, then we're going to help their stress levels. And, we can do different things to help ourselves here. Things like 5 ways to well-being. So we've got things connecting with people, being active, taking notice, keeping learning and give. And there's also another one that's called 10 Keys to Happier Living, which Action for Happiness created in 2011. And our biggest one for helping ourselves, which we can do all the time within our network of bands, is talking. That is so valuable to encouraging people to have better mental health and putting those support structures in place. If we can start conversations, and they don't have to be specifically about mental health, but just building an environment where it's okay to talk about anything within our bands, can be really supportive for our musicians. Okay, we want to be able to play for better mental health as such. Has anyone heard of the fish philosophy? No? Okay, so this is the fish philosophy is just one of a kind of culture that can be built. It was actually built within workplaces, and it stemmed from the Pike Street fish market in Seattle. So they have one of, really horrendous job, up ridiculously early hours of the morning, freezing cold. It's always raining in Seattle, and they're getting fish in from the fishermen and they're selling it, and it's cold and it's not nice at all, so they decided to make it fun. So if you walk in there, you'll see fish flying over, everyone having fun, shouting, enjoying, and you know, having a great time. They brought this philosophy into their workplace, and this has now been brought into workplaces, schools, and it's something that we can think about, you know, in our band rooms as well. And it's based on these 4 principles of playing, which is having fun with what we do, being there for everyone around us, choosing our attitude, okay, so we can choose whether we're in a good mood or a bad mood, or how we respond to that, how we control it, and make their day, which is being there for someone, and, you know, helping them with something that they might taking the time to give them that attention, okay. So we can think about bringing this culture into our band rooms, which will really really help. We need to be mindful of how we think about things, and bear in mind that that might not be how other people think. So this is what we call our frame of reference, okay? We all have a different outlook on the world. If we all looked out of the same window now, we would all see something very, very different. And that's our frame of reference, okay? And we need to be able to set that aside when talking to someone else. We need to understand that whilst we might not be nervous about the performance that's coming up in our band, the person sat next to us might be absolutely terrified of it. Okay, so we need to be mindful of this, set our own frame of reference aside in order to support our friends and our colleagues. What we also need to really bear in mind as well, that mental health is not scary, okay? And I say this a lot, mental health is not scary, but we are scared of it. And we're generally scared because we don't talk about it enough, or there's a lack of education, a lack of awareness about it. And I hope by being a part of conversations like this one we're having now, that you will be able to kind of open up those conversations within your own bands, your own family networks, friends, workplaces, whatever it is. And having open conversations is going to help us to reduce the stigma around mental health. In terms of people and how we are, essentially there are 4 types of people. And we're going to look a little bit of spotting signs and symptoms now. 4 types of people that we'll come across. People, and this is on our continuum. Our continuum of mental health isn't just one axis of good to bad mental health, okay? So if you imagine 2 axes crossing and your horizontal axis is going from left to right of a diagnosis to no diagnosis, and you've got a vertical axis of well-being which goes from low well-being to high well-being, that divides us into 4 quarters. And within those 4 quarters, we're going to have people with a mental health diagnosis who are healthy and performing well because they're managing their condition through medication, counselling, support and work and so on. So they're going to be our top left quartile. People with a diagnosis who are unwell, they're going to be our bottom left quartile. People with no diagnosis who are well, they're top right, and people with no diagnosis but who are very unwell and may not even realise it, but whose performance is likely to be impaired, they're bottom right. And the thing about the people that fall into bottom right is often they don't even realise that they're unwell themselves. They don't realise that there's something wrong necessarily. They just are very blinkered by what they're feeling, okay? So what we can learn to do, especially in bands, because we're seeing people, okay, less so because of COVID, but because we're seeing people regularly, we can just be aware of some of the signs, general signs and symptoms of mental ill health, okay? Now, some conditions will have specific signs and symptoms, but as a general rule, in terms of spotting signs and symptoms, this is what we're looking at, okay? Changes in behaviour of people, okay? They might be complaining about workloads and pressures. There might be an increased consumption of caffeine, alcohol, cigarettes, drugs, indecisive. They might be lacking confidence. They might be getting more argumentative with people. They might be taking on too much or volunteering for everything. They might be loud or more exuberant than usual. But there's also, we work on very much extremes of behaviour. So that's what we're really looking for as well. So someone might be louder or more exuberant, but if they were always quite chirpy and outspoken, they might be really quiet, okay? So if someone would drink a lot, they're not drinking anything. If they would eat a lot, or then they might not. So it's the extremes of behaviours. So someone might become withdrawn. They might not want to partake. They might not go to the pub after band or something like that, having always been the one that was there. They might be kind of going wrong a little bit more in rehearsal because they're just clearly not concentrating. There's something on their mind. They might have difficulty remembering things. So they might get told something one rehearsal and then have forgotten it next time. Things like this. They might miss rehearsals more. They might be making more mistakes. They might be absolutely adamant that they're completely right when, you know, they're absolutely not. And they might be kind of acting negatively as well. So all these things, when we notice this in someone, and we are so blessed in brass bands that we do have the opportunity to see people regularly, so we can really take notice of behaviours and spot signs that might just make us think, I don't think everything's all right there. And the likelihood is that we'll just say to someone, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And what's the usual answer we all give?
Fine.
Fine.
I'm fine. That's it. So we need to have an intention to hear the answer. Okay. So if they ask that, but you've noticed some things, then don't be scared to ask that question again. That's a really valuable thing to do. Physical warning signs of mental ill health might be constant tiredness. It might be being run down, difficulty sleeping. Someone might, you know, be really struggling. They might be sick a lot, headaches, weight loss or gain. There might be physical things like rashes or eczema or things. Okay. So if we notice these things, the most important thing is to broach it, but in a confidential way. And with mental health, what we always say is that we will give confidentiality to anyone that speaks to us, but only up until a point of safety. Okay, so if we think someone's at risk to themselves, to ourselves, or to other people, then we, you know, if it's extreme situation, it might be that you just get on the phone to, be it police or ambulance or whatever it is, but always be mindful of safety. That has to come first. But ask them for a chat, you know, but don't just necessarily do it sat in rehearsal or in the band room. Do it, ask them if they want to go privately, tell them that you've noticed something. And let them know that they can trust you. Okay, so back up your concerns with examples, be it dates and times or things, but don't judge them for it. Don't focus on the behavior, focus on the feelings behind it. That's the important thing. Okay, so don't take I'm fine for an answer, because people will be resistant, and that's okay. So just ask them again. So, and always try and move conversations forward. And if someone doesn't want to talk, if we can let them know that we're always there, then that would really help them. Okay, if they get upset, let them get upset. Okay, they'll carry on when they're ready, but just give them that supportive space to be able to speak. And you know, we don't want to say to someone that we can fix it. We're not there to fix their problems, but we can take time to say, look, I'm going to help you, and I'll find out the information that so I can signpost you to the right things. Okay, we want to listen to people non-judgmentally. Okay, and it's these non-judgmental listening skills which are really, really vital. So we communicate in two different ways. What two ways do we communicate?
Verbally and non.
Yeah, verbally and non-verbally. Which way do we use most?
Verbally.
Non-verbal.
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 Verbal.
Yeah, so we actually use non-verbal communication 65% of the time and verbal 35% of the time. Okay. And our non-judgmental listening needs to be based on these three kind of ideas. So acceptance, we're going to respect a person's feelings, whether we understand them or not, or whether we feel the same, but that is their reality. Okay, so we're going to respect their feelings, experiences and values. Okay, and we're not judging on our own frame of reference. We're going to show genuineness, show that we accept them and their values, okay, without making those moral judgments. And we're going to show empathy as well. So and that's the ability to place yourself in someone else's shoes. In terms of the breakdown of verbal and non-verbal skills, verbal is listening without interrupting, paying attention, asking appropriate questions to make sure we're clear about what's been said, listening to words and tone of voice, checking you understand by restating words and summarizing facts and feelings. Non-verbal, being attentive, keeping appropriate eye contact, so we're not staring at people. Open body position is really important, so not closed arms or looking really stressed or annoyed with someone. Sitting down you're going to get someone to talk much better. It makes us seem less threatening, but trying not to sit directly opposite, so it's not confrontational. Empathy and sympathy, just in terms of what the difference is. Empathy, so there's a short video which I can share a link with later, actually, that the American shame and vulnerability researcher Brené Brown did, which is really good. It gives a good definition of empathy and sympathy. But essentially, empathy is I'm feeling with you, and sympathy is I'm feeling for you. So we don't want to feel sorry for people, we want to feel with them, okay? So whether it's something we understand or not, that we can just say to someone, look, I can see that this is really bad for you, this is really painful for you, but I'm here for you, okay? So that's the most important thing. Now, possibly if you've approached someone before and you've kind of noticed, you might have noticed things, or you've tried to broach conversations with them, they've been quite resistant to it. A lot of people are really reluctant to talk, okay? And the reasons that they'll be reluctant to talk, and this can be especially the case in a brass band environment, is because they're worried about being judged. Okay, for one, they don't know if it's always safe to be open and trust with you. For a lot of people, going to band is their safe space. It's what they do for their well-being. So they don't want to, they want to shut out everything else that's going on in their life and go to band. Okay, that is their helpful coping strategy, but sometimes they might be carrying this baggage into the band room, which can cause concerns. So I had a situation, there was a player who came to me and said they'd been really struggling, and they were a trombone player, second trombone player in a band, and they'd really felt like they had to leave the band, okay, because they were really struggling. They'd been sat next to this bass trombone player for many years, and they'd got on absolutely fine, and they'd got a good section, but recently he'd started going to band. He was being quite aggressive, quite nasty, always telling her that she was wrong, and a real change in behavior, to the point that the player's like, I can't put up with this anymore, you know, I'm going to have to leave. And as a consequence of that one person leaving, it created internal band issues, and several players left. I'm sure we've all had this situation where one player goes and then everyone else decides that they should go as well, and then we find ourselves with half a band and not knowing the reason why. But if the question had ever been asked or questioned to this player, what had actually occurred was the bass trombone player's wife had been taken very, very ill, and he was having to work full time and care for her, but he didn't want anyone to know, because going to band was his safe space where he could switch off. It was the only thing he had for him. But because of the stress that he was under, that was manifesting in how he treated others, okay? And then this had a knock-on effect around the whole band. But if someone had just questioned that right from the start and said, look, I've noticed a change in your behavior. Are you okay? Is there anything we can do? And possibly would have been very reluctant, because this was his safe space, his happy space. But if that question had been asked again and again, said, no, you know, well, if you don't want to talk now, the door's always open, but if we could have coerced this conversation a little bit, then it could be a very different story, because he could have opened up and got the support that he needed from his friends and family. And this is such a common thing, that often players have left bands because of internal relationships with other players. But this has come as a place of not people being bad, but just the stress that they're under. So in bands, if we can address this and have someone within our band setup who is a mental health lead, if you like, they don't have to be a trained mental health first aider, but at least a mental health lead, they can spot these signs and they can have these conversations and encourage these conversations, which can not only help that individual with the stress that they're doing, but also help protect how we keep our players in bands, because we're losing so many players because of this stress. So people will be reluctant to talk. So they want to know that it's safe to be open with you, that they can trust you, that anything will be treated safely and positively, and they're not going to be discriminated. It says at work there, but in the band room as well, that they're not going to be discriminated against. And it's not just a case of talking. If I said to you, are you a good listener? Would you say yes?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, good. Okay, we're all generally good listeners. We want to be there. But in order to really help people, it's active listening skills, okay, that we want to implement. So we want to ask open questions about what's happening, how people are feeling, how stress is impacting them, and things like this, how long they've felt this way. So active listening is about asking questions which really move a conversation on, okay? And it's also about being brave enough to hold silences when people don't want to talk or they're feeling upset, to let that silence linger, okay? To create this safe space where silence is okay, because if someone feels that trust within a silence, they're more likely to open up. On the flip side of that, though, someone might sort of really kind of get complete verbal diarrhea and keep talking at you, if you've got kind of 5 minutes and they might just be constantly talking and this is wrong and that's wrong and this and all the rest of it, that's when active listening, we need to get in there with questions that just say, oh, can you just clarify what you just said about that? How does that make you feel? To stop someone in their tracks, okay? To be brave enough to do that, to try and really get to the source of what they're feeling. So in terms of active listening skills, okay, we're going to ask people what's contributed to how they're feeling, listening again without judgment. What are their concerns? You know, what would help them, but not putting pressure on them. Are they aware of possible sources of support? Is there anything that we can do? And when we're talking to people, I use this little clear, the word clear, okay? And what clear stands for is confident and comfortable, lean into conversations, okay? So that's our non-verbal communication, empathize, acknowledge what someone's going through, that this is their reality and that's okay, and respond, okay? Don't react. We want to listen to understand and not listen to reply, okay? So we're going to respond to people, and it's quite all right to say, thank you very much for sharing that with me, but I want to do the best thing by you. So let me have a day, a couple of days to get some information on the support that you need so I can really help you, okay? So it's okay to take that time to respond. Right, just before we go into breakout groups so we can have discussions about things, and in the breakout groups, what I want to do is for you to discuss how you can bring supports into your band organization for mental health, okay? So I have a draft mental health policy which I've drafted, which is available for free for bands, but how can you put better supports in your banding organization? Because I think it's really important to try and have be it a mental health lead or someone that's trained as a mental health first aider, to have those supports and in place so everyone knows that it's okay to have conversations about mental health, but to know that there is someone there who can help them get the help that they need if they are in distress, okay? Just before we do the breakout groups, I'm just going to whiz you through very quickly some mental health conditions which might be appear that people experience within our bands, okay? So this isn't an in-depth, this is just a quick whiz through. So we're going to look at anxiety disorders, self-harm, suicide, bipolar, eating disorders, psychosis, and depression. Okay, so very quickly, depression, what these conditions are. Depression is a low mood that lasts for a long time, affects everyday life. All of us get low moods, feel a little bit blue, but someone that's can be diagnosed with clinical depression when this has lasted, these symptoms have lasted for at least 2 weeks, and they affect a person's behaviour. With a physical, emotional and cognitive effect, okay? This affects their ability to both work and have satisfying relationships. So this could be quite something someone's experienced. So if you notice something, a change in someone's behavior, but it's consistent for over 2 weeks, then it might be something that they need help and support for. And if we can encourage someone to go to a GP, that's really good. Not just to go to a GP because we're saying we think you have a mental health problem or condition, but because behind every mental health issue, there could be a physical issue that's causing problems, okay? So we want people to be fit and well. So if we can signpost them towards a GP for that, that's great. So depression falls under what we call mood disorders. Anxiety disorders, we've got anxiety. Everybody experiences nerves or anxiety. It's a very normal thing, okay? It's our natural response, helping us avoid dangerous situations. So we've talked about our fight, flight, freeze and flop. So in brass bands, very, very common for people to get nervous before a performance. But when that goes a little bit further, when it becomes a little bit more severe or long lasting, interferes with someone's playing or their performance, then this could be an anxiety disorder. Common anxiety disorders are things like generalized anxiety, social anxiety, panic disorder, phobias, post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress disorder as well. So if someone's been through a traumatic event, be that an accident or they've experienced something, either in person or third hand, a lot of people can experience acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder just by witnessing things on the news and the media these days, be that terrorist events or global events. So yeah, need to be mindful of that. And there's obsessive compulsive disorder, and anyone that's pregnant or post-natal, they can experience anxiety as well. So we could be mindful of when it just goes from a little bit nerves about performance to when it becomes a little bit more serious. And our crisis situation, if you like, for anxiety would be panic attacks. So if someone hasn't got control of their anxiety or even their nerves pre-performance, if they haven't got things to manage that, then they might well experience a panic attack. Okay, that could be quite common there. Suicide is very serious. We've talked about it is but suicidal thoughts are very, very common. Okay, and apparently about 20.6% of the population will experience suicidal thoughts at some time, but never act on them. Okay, so they can be very common. Suicide is actually our crisis situation, if you like, for depression. So that's why we need to signpost people to help early if they're experiencing depression, to try and help reduce rates around suicide. Other things that people in our bands might be experiencing: eating disorders. 3 most common eating disorders are bulimia, anorexia, and binge eating disorder. Of those, the most common is binge eating disorder. Anorexia is actually the least common. Again, if you're noticing a change in eating habits of someone, that might be eating far less, eating far more. It might be if you go for a band dinner and after every course someone's nipping to the toilet, that might be a sign of bulimia. So things that we can be mindful of. Self-harm as well. Self-harm is actually a behavior, not an illness per se, and it is essentially when someone is going through something so bad but they haven't got the words to verbalize it. The pain that they feel expresses their emotional state. Okay, so signs that we could look for in terms of changes of behavior: if someone's always wears short sleeves, is suddenly always wearing long sleeves, always covering things up, things like that are signs that we could be mindful of. And knowing as well that things like self-harm, they go hand in hand with anxiety and depression. Self-harm and eating disorders, they're both a coping mechanism. They're not about the food, they're not about the hurting themselves. They are ways that someone is coping with something far more emotional and traumatic that they're going through. At the extreme of our mental health conditions, we've got things like psychosis. So that's based on distortions of reality. So if someone's experiencing hallucinations, thought disorders, delusions, or anything like that, then we definitely know. If someone comes into the band room and has experienced those kind of things, then we definitely know it's time to signpost them to some help there. And the one thing that we really need to remember, though, whatever anyone's experiencing, there's always hope, and recovery is absolutely possible. And that is the most important thing. Okay, that recovery does look different to a lot of people. That doesn't necessarily mean going back to original happy self, but it might be managing things with medication, or so be it. So that's a quick whiz through mental health conditions and the such there, and sort of just bringing you a little bit more kind of education around mental health.